Welcome, everybody. My name is Susanna Lohmann, and I am the chair of the Faculty Selection Committee of the Marschak Colloquium. And we are positively thrilled to introduce Lynn Vavreck and Chris Tausanovitch, two of my colleagues in political science at UCLA. Lynn is the Marvin Hoffenberg Chair in American Politics and Public Policy. She got her Ph.D. at the University of Rochester in 1997, and I would like to point out that Rochester at the time was one of the most exciting political science departments in all of the United States. Okay. Well, I guess you're a Ph.D. student there. Okay. Chris Tausanovitch got his Ph.D. from Stanford University in 2013. Chris and Lynn co-authored this book, The Bitter End, but I would like to add that Lynn has pioneered the art of writing biographies, not of persons, but of presidential campaigns. And so this is actually her third book after The Gamble and Identity Crisis, and then now The Bitter End. And so we totally look forward to hearing your take on what has happened this year. Thank you.
I'm going to use one of these. Okay, great. Thank you so much for having us, and thanks to everyone for coming out. Chris and I have spent a lot of time thinking about presidential elections and presidential campaigns and what it all means. Most of that time was spent thinking about 2016 and 2020, but we have spent some time since 2 Tuesdays ago thinking about 2024. And so we are going to share with you today a little bit of how we think about the 2024 outcome. And a lot of it is going to be couched in the work that we did for this book that Susanna just talked about, The Bitter End. And so I've kind of said, I've put the and beyond here. So, the bitter end and beyond. And so today we're in the and beyond phase, but I think as a teaser, I'm going to lead with the fact that we're really not beyond 2016. And so that's kind of the framework that I'm going to talk about. So how we're going to organize this is I'm going to talk about sort of big picture, broad kind of takeaways from 2024. And then I'm going to hand it off to Chris, and he is going to drill down and talk about a couple of things that we think are really interesting about the 2024 outcome. So we'll go from a wide lens to a very narrow lens. And then we'll look forward to your questions, which I'm sure will make everything wider and broad again. Okay, so I want to start thinking about 2024 by taking us back to 2008. And so in 2008, in that campaign, if you can remember, Barack Obama met a guy named Joe. And this is Joe. And Joe was a plumber. And Barack Obama and John McCain spent the better part of 3 weeks of the 2008 campaign talking about Joe the plumber and whether his taxes would be raised under Obama's plan to raise taxes on families earning more than $250,000 a year. And this was a real point of contention in the 2008 campaign in Ohio. And John McCain is going to meet Joe the plumber a few weeks later on the same street in Ohio, and he is going to say to him, "Congratulations, Joe, you're rich." Of course, Joe the plumber didn't feel rich, and so this is what the 2008 campaign was largely about as it played out in front of the global financial crisis. And so that's Ohio in 2008. And so now I want to take you to Ohio in 2024. And in 2024 in Ohio, politics feels more divisive. We are fighting over different kinds of things, immigration and abortion, two things that we're going to hear about in the second half of today's talk. And of course, in Ohio in 2024, we had a weeks-long conversation not about tax policy or household income, but about whether immigrants who had come to Ohio were eating the pets of their neighbors. This is a very different kind of politics. And the takeaway for me as I think about this is about 100 years of American history. And it's not 1930 anymore. And that is the way that people are still thinking about American politics. So many people ask me, when is this going to be over? When are we going back? When will we not be fighting about these things anymore? And my answer to that question, I've decided after last 2 Tuesdays ago, is that it is not 1930 anymore. It's 2030. The next president will take office in 2029. We are in the 21st century. A quarter of it is over. And we are still thinking back to the New Deal. New Deal politics is not what we're fighting over anymore. We are fighting over a new dimension of conflict, and it's this identity-inflected dimension, and those politics have reshaped the political landscape. We wrote about this in The Bitter End, and I wrote about it with my other co-authors, John Sides and Michael Tesler, in Identity Crisis in 2016. But it takes a little bit of time to really see if a pattern is durable. And so now, our third election in, I'm willing to say that I think New Deal politics are not the structuring conflict of American politics anymore. Okay, so how do we make sense? How did this happen? This is another question that I think about a lot. How much of it was inevitable? How much of it was just Donald Trump? And of course, the answer to this question is, yes and yes. Both of those things are true. And so to give you a sense of what was out there before Trump comes down the escalator in 2015 and talks about people from Mexico, Mexico's not sending its best, we're going to have a religious test to enter the country. Before he does all of that, this is data from 2012. And we're looking here at panel data. So we had interviewed people in 2011 and asked them a bunch of survey questions. And I'm showing you here, these are white voters who voted for Barack Obama in 2012. So we asked them about these questions in 2011, and then we go back to the same people in 2012 and we ask them who they voted for. So among white voters in 2012 who voted for Barack Obama, 35% of them rated Muslims on the less favorable side of a 0 to 100 point scale. So a third of white Obama voters had negative views of Muslims as a group. 34% favored making it harder to immigrate to the United States. And 32% believed that illegal immigrants were mostly a drain on society. That's a third of white Obama voters believing that immigrants are mostly a drain on society, illegal immigrants. That was the wording of the question. And they voted for Barack Obama, largely because in 2012, these things were not contested dimensions of the contest. If you think about immigration in 2012, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, they talked about immigration, for like 5 minutes on one day. There's no better way to make an issue irrelevant in a presidential campaign than to have both candidates have the same position on that issue. If they have the same position, they split the votes. They know that. That's not advantageous to them. It does not become a point of contention. This was not contested politics in 2012, and so these white voters were voting for Barack Obama. Didn't seem like they had a choice to make on these things. But of course, if we fast forward to 2015, when Donald Trump comes down the escalator and he says, this is a problem, and I have a different position on this than my opponent. I think this, she does not. This 32% of white Obama, they have something to think about now. He says, we're going to have a religious test to enter the country. Well, maybe I'm misaligned with the Democratic Party. When this becomes important, then people resort themselves between the two parties. And the argument that I want to make to you here in the next 5 minutes or so is that that resorting happened in 2016, and that resorting endures in 2020 and in 2024. So these are now the dimensions of conflict, And Chris is going to try to show you a little bit of data about that. These are important dimensions of conflict, and a sorting happened in 2016, and it persists. So the way I'm going to show you that is I'm going to show you a bunch of figures that look like this. And so we'll take a minute to orient ourselves. On the horizontal axis, I'm going to have the Democratic Party's share of the vote in one election. Here it's 2008. And then on the vertical axis, I'm going to show you their two-party share of the vote in a subsequent election. Most of the time, it's going to be the next election. So from 8 to 12. The plotting symbols here are states. So I'm showing you the Democratic Party's share of the vote in each state in the country. The line is a 45-degree line. So if every state got the same exact amount in 2008 and in 2012, the dot would be on the line, and all the dots would be on the line. Okay, so the 45-degree line is if every state does exactly, the Democrat does exactly the same in two-party share. Okay, so this is 8 to 12, and what you can see here, most of the dots below the line. What is that? That's a little bit the shine coming off of Barack Obama. Global financial crisis in 2008, he does well. And then in 2012, maybe it's a little bit of a re-equilibration back to what the normal Democratic vote might be. So, pretty uniform shift down. He does less well almost everywhere. Okay, so now let's look at the same, and this is what elections look like. We could go back, we could go 4 to 8, we could go 2000 to 04, and we typically see the states moving in a uniform fashion. So now let's look at 12 to 16. Here we see some dots above the line, Texas, Georgia, Arizona, California. That's Hillary Clinton doing better than Barack Obama did in 2012. So she's picking up votes in some places, but then in other places, the dots below the line, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that's Hillary Clinton losing votes relative to Barack Obama in 2012. So this pattern, some above, some below, is unusual. And what I'm suggesting to you is that this is the evidence that in 2016, something shifted. Everybody didn't move in the same direction. Some places, people moved more Democratic. Other places, people moved more Republican. And it's whether people are sorting between the two parties or whether people within the parties are changing their minds. We'll stay a little agnostic on that at this point. But it's a reshuffling of the dimension of conflict. Now, the real test for me was going to be what happened between 16 and 20. So if we see basically a flip of this, right, these states go below, these states go up, that would be evidence that we're just going back, right, we're re-equilibrating back. But if we see something that looked like a uniform shift, then that was going to suggest to me that this new dimension of conflict, that is persisting. And when we drew this picture for the bitter end, from 16 to 20, it looked like this. So not only do we not see the reshuffling, and not only do we see a pretty uniform shift, there's basically hardly any shift at all. The 2020 election was largely a repeat of the 2016 election, state by state, in almost every state in the country. In the book, we also drew this for counties, and county by county, the absolute average swing from 16 to 20 was around 2 points. So that 2020 election was a replay of 2016, and the outcome was just ever so slightly more for Biden. Right? So while Trump wins in 16, the uniform shift here is largely up, and so Biden is going to eke out that win, 33,000 votes in 3 states. Okay, so what happens when we draw 2020 to 2024? What do we see? And so here's 2020, 2024, and again, now I've added a line of best fit through these dots, and you can see this is a uniform shift down. So that's Democrats losing vote share, where? Pretty much everywhere. Okay, so in 2020, they picked up a little relative to 16. In 2024, they lost a little bit relative to 20. Okay, but that made me think, what does this picture look like if I put 2016 on the bottom and 2024 here? So is the 2024 election basically a replay of 2016 as well? Right, this election that I'm trying to convince you is like the beginning of the new era of American politics. And when we do that, we see something pretty close to the 45-degree line. So this is 2016 now and 2024. So state by state, the 2024 outcomes are basically a replay of the 2016 election. So that 2016 election was a shifting point. It reorganized votes, and now that shift has been durable. And then I'll just show you one last thing, and then I'm going to hand it off to Chris. So when we look at how many people are actually moving, one of the things that you heard 2 Tuesdays ago, particularly from Donald Trump, is that it was a landslide. He won in a landslide. Well, you know, these figures also show you that, you know, this is not a landslide. This is uniform shift down, but, you know, on average, these shifts are not big. In some places, among some groups, yes, the losses were big. But on average, they are not. And when we look at individual voters, so here we've got panel data. We interviewed the same people. And I want you to read across the rows. So this is who people voted for in 2012. This is who they voted for in 2016. So among people who told us in 2012 they voted for Obama, what did they tell us they did in 2016? 81% stuck with Clinton, but 9% peeled off for Trump. This 81, that's a low number. That's a low number for a table like this. You want to be holding on to more of your voters than that. Romney, 84, also a low number. This transition reshuffled people. Here, from 16 to 20, Hillary Clinton, voters in 16, 95% of them are sticking around to vote for Biden in 2020. Again, this is panel data. And among Trump voters, 94% of them voting for him again. So now we're sticky. We've reshuffled, and now we're stuck. So what happens, how many of the 2020 voters stuck with their candidate? Now, this is panel data from YouGov, and these are people who in 2020 told us who they voted for, and then we've re-interviewed and asked them who they're, sorry, no, I decided not to do YouGov. Sorry, this is the exit poll data from last week. So these are not, this is not a panel. Okay, I have panel data, it looks very similar to this, but I wanted to show you the actual exit poll data. So this is now in 2024, we're interviewing people and we're asking them who they voted for in 2020. It's a less good test, for sure. But among people who tell us they voted for Biden in 2020, 93% are sticking with Harris. Among Trump voters, 95% sticking with Trump. It's interesting, the difference in these numbers. You know, and that's pretty consistent with how the election went, but it's not a landslide, right? They're hanging on to their voters. It looks very similar to the 16 to 20 transition, with just this uniform shift a little bit away from the Democratic Party. And it's obviously very difficult to pinpoint 2 weeks later exactly what the driver of that was, but if my life depended on it for my money, that's the state of the nation's economy. In the exit poll data, vast majorities of Americans, nearly everybody reported some kind of financial hardship from inflation. And there are just tons and tons of pieces of evidence from the exit poll suggesting that the economy was the thing that people were thinking about and that they had been negatively impacted by it, even though, objectively speaking, growth is good. Okay, so my takeaway, and then I'm going to hand this off to Chris, is that the politics of the 21st century in America start in 2016. And we have to stop thinking about the role and size of government and the tax rate and all of those New Deal type issues from the 1930s. because we are in a new era of American politics. This is what's coming for us. Policies about bathrooms, about sports teams, trans policy, all this stuff. It's really different than the 1980s and the moral majority when the Republican Party was talking about not standing behind divorced families or single parent families. They weren't going to legislate divorce, but bathrooms and sports teams, we've got to write down policies and rules about these things. And it's not going away. And so I think this is where we're headed. But I'm going to hand it off to Chris.
So, thank you, Lynn. We are now deep into 2024 election take season, which is why many of you are here. And a lot of the question that people ask folks like me and Lynn is, what caused Trump to win in 2024? And what they're often looking for is kind of one necessary and sufficient condition for why the election went the way that it went. This was, as Lynn showed, a very close election, and we've got a lot of very confident takes about what happened. It was Biden's fault, it wasn't Biden's fault, it is the young progressives, or it's not, or it's wokeism in the Democratic Party, or it's not. Pelosi blames the lack of an open primary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what's clear here from a social science perspective is that it's going to be pretty hard to find. There might not be a necessary and sufficient condition. And in fact, if you think about things that could have been different, there might be many things that would be sufficient for the election outcome to be different. And so this quest for the one thing is a little bit misguided. And it also, of course, should be pursued with the humility that this is a single election. And so in trying to think about these things, we're going to think about the variation that we have in this one election that we saw. We're going to be thinking about, well, what happened in other elections with similar conditions, that kind of thing. But saying things about elections in general may be in a sense easier than saying something about what exactly happened in this election. What I think is profitable to do is to take some factors that might be interesting or that we might think were a big deal, and to think about how those factors played out. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm a scholar of representation, and so I think about policy issues. And some folks, when they think about policy issues, they think like, well, did policy issues matter at all? And so we're gonna think that through in the case of two of the most prominent campaign issues, and that's immigration and abortion. These are issues where the public had very different trajectories of public opinion leading up to the election, and each side saw an opportunity to exploit a wedge issue, an issue on which they were favored in public opinion. And we want to know, was this successful on both sides? Did they pick their issues well? So let's think through that a little bit. What we want to think through first is, are these actually issues that matter to voters? We've got a lot of public opinion data on these issues. A lot of it is, do you care about abortion as an issue? Is abortion important to you personally? Is immigration important to you personally? We're going to show that way of asking is not going to be enough for us to think about this question. And instead, I'm going to turn to a set of experiments that we did in 2020 when we ran this 80-week-long, over 500,000 people Nationscape survey. What we did in 2020 was the usual thing. So if we wanted to know if people supported national government health insurance, we asked them, and they could agree or they could disagree. But we also did something else. We asked them to evaluate sets of policies. So instead of just asking about one thing now, we're asking about multiple things. We're randomly including policies in various sets. And so now, if you're somebody who supports the idea of providing government-run health insurance to all Americans, you might be inclined towards choosing set A here. You're just choosing between policies that might exist in the world. But you might also have a view on whether or not we should create a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants who are brought here as children. And if that's something that you support, then now you have a decision to make. Because in order to choose that, you have to choose set B. And also, if you're choosing set B, you're choosing to allow the display of the Ten Commandments in public schools and courthouses, which may or may not be something that you support. And so this is going to be a hard question for a lot of people. It's going to force them to think about, what do I really care about? And what we get out of it is a set of estimates of which of these policies are driving people's choices. Which of these policies are the ones that are going to tell me whether this person chose set A and set B, knowing what they believe about each of these policies beforehand. And so that's going to allow us to make a graph like this one, which has ranked for all these policies. It's going to be quite hard to read, how much people care about it in terms of how much it's driving that choice. And what we saw in 2020 is that a lot of the issues that people cared the most about were what we called identity-inflected issues, and in particular, immigration and abortion. So people cared deeply about the issue at the time of separating parents from their children at the border. That was a very big issue for people, and people were very against that. People are not supportive of allowing late-term abortion. At the same time, people are not supportive of the idea of banning abortion, and they feel very strongly about both of those things, although slightly more strongly, I would note, about the idea of late-term abortion, but with slightly fewer people supporting it, solid majorities in both cases. They feel strongly about mass deportation, although people who support mass deportation also feel strongly about it. They feel strongly about the idea then of building a wall, about this idea of banning Muslim immigrants, a little less strongly about conditions for abortion that are a little more lenient. One of the things that you see here is also that you can't think about these just in terms of broad issue categories, because if we ask whether people think that abortion coverage in healthcare should be optional or whether we should have required waiting periods to get an abortion, people feel a lot less strongly about those policies in this policy area than they do about banning abortion or about late-term abortion. So we'll come back to that. Bottom line, people care a lot about these issues in 2020. Not too surprising. These are centerpiece issues of the campaigns in 2024. This data is from the Wesleyan Media Project. They're coding what issues get mentioned in advertising in 2024, and they've got both the candidates and the two main super PACs supporting the candidates here. And what do you see? You see women's rights and abortion are top issues for Kamala Harris. Immigration is the second from the top issue for Donald Trump. Immigration is also playing a big role in the super PAC ads supporting Donald Trump. Less abortion, less women's rights in the main super PAC supporting Kamala Harris, and I think that's notable. So I'm gonna come back to that as well. But these are big issues in the campaign, and perhaps not surprisingly, because there's a lot going on in the country on these issues, as well as the fact that these are issues that people care about. So in 2022, we get the Dodd decision that rolls back Roe v. Wade, and I believe 22 states implemented some sort of abortion restriction during that time. Some of the reddest states, 13, ban abortion entirely. You get a range of other states that are limiting abortion in terms of how late in a pregnancy an abortion can be obtained. And a majority of people support, or at least are against the idea of banning abortion entirely. People care about this issue, and so it makes sense that the Harris campaign chose this as a big campaign issue. We have data telling us that while there are some very conservative states where a majority does not support legal abortion, overwhelmingly in most states people do support legal abortion. And even in some of these states that are implementing restrictions, the majority of the population of those states is against it in a number of cases. So what's going on this issue in terms of what people believe? Well, actually, it's quite stable. People, for the most part, have supported, a majority has supported abortion being legal under some circumstances. A large fraction of the population has supported that for a long time, 35%. 50% of the population says legal under only certain circumstances. So that's the most common view on abortion. It's only 12% that says always illegal and 35% that says always legal under any circumstance. Average voter is part of that purple line there. Not a lot has changed. Not a lot has changed also in terms of whether people think of themselves as pro-choice or as pro-life, with a majority saying pro-choice. Not entirely clear what this means when most people are saying that they favor some restrictions and not an outright ban. What we do see when we look at Republicans specifically is that Republicans oppose banning abortion, but they care a lot more. They care more about border security, but I'm not so sure why that slide says this. They care a lot more about late-term abortion, and they care more about immigration as an issue. Particularly, Republicans who oppose banning abortion care less about it. Republicans who support banning abortion, they care a lot more about that issue. We also, during this election, had a number of states that had abortion ballot measures. And one hypothesis here was that this is an issue that would drive people to the polls for Kamala Harris because they care deeply about it in places like Florida, places like Nevada. And it looks like, so here, this is a lot like some of the graphs that Lynn was showing you earlier. We've got the turnout rate in 2020, so instead of the percentage of people voting for the Democratic candidate, this is just the percentage of people turning out of the voting eligible population in 2020 and 2024. This is the 45-degree line. Here is the line of best fit, and so that's what's typically going on, is that you've got a slightly lower turnout rate in a lot of these states. But what you see is the green states, the states that had abortion ballot measures, are pretty typical, with the exception of maybe Nevada. You don't have some groundswell of additional turnout on these abortion ballot measures. And so was this issue impactful? Maybe. It was not a dumb issue to choose. It's one where the Democratic candidate is favored, but there are some mitigating factors here. Donald Trump runs on this idea that the states should decide. He says that he disapproves of states that are implementing the most extreme restrictions. Notably, he said he was the father of IVF when IVF became wrapped up in this abortion debate. And so those are middle-of-the-road opinions, notwithstanding the fact that it was Trump appointing Supreme Court justices who made this change, and that this is an unpopular change. Majorities dislike bans and dislike late-term abortion, but you see the Trump campaign trying to paint Harris as somebody who might support late-term abortion and things like that. And of particular note here, I think, is the fact that this is an issue that works really well for the demographics that the Harris campaign was already going to expect to win. It's an issue that works less well, where the intensity is less among Republicans, the kind of people who are potential crossover voters, and possibly among men and Black and Hispanic men, who are a group that Harris lost in this election relative to Biden in 2020. So what about immigration? The facts on the ground on immigration leading up to this election is that we had a large surge in arrivals at the border very soon after Biden takes office. And it's not entirely clear to me, as a non-expert in immigration per se, how much this has to do with the 20-some-odd executive orders that the Biden administration passed, or just expectations that potential immigrants had about the new administration. However, this is what happened. You had a lot more arrivals, and this is causing big problems. It's not until quite late in the Biden term that this gets addressed, with Kamala Harris during the campaign pointing out that the Democrats passed a very strict border security bill, or tried to, and Republicans only withdrew their support for this bill because Donald Trump asked them to take away this campaign issue. So you've got Harris trying to mitigate this issue by saying that. But this doesn't really do much about the fact that across parties, across years, large majorities of the public are saying that this is an issue that was handled badly by the government. That the issue of additional border arrivals was handled badly. You also have a very big change in opinion on this issue over the course of the Biden administration. 2020, when we were in the field with Nationscape during the last election, was a historic high point in support for immigration. It's the only time in American history that we've had polls with more Americans supporting increased immigration than supporting decreased immigration. Over the course of Biden's administration, this trend reverses to the point where, according to Gallup, we are back to a more historically normal level of Americans saying that they support increased immigration. So people really care about this, but opinion has moved in a big way over the course of the administration. So was this issue an impactful one? I think that you have to say that it quite probably was. You see big attempts by the Biden administration, a little too late perhaps, to address the issue. You see a big attempt by the Harris campaign to address the issue, despite the fact that it's entirely true that Trump torpedoed this bill in the last year. It's also true that these were the facts on the ground for most of the Biden administration. That early on, the Biden administration may have seen this historic change of opinion and thought that they were on the right side of the public, but that just changed over the course of those 4 years, when the public cared a lot and opinion moved substantially. We could think about what are the other issues that you might consider in the consideration of how issues played in this campaign. One of them would be democracy. We did run some surveys in Nationscape with these experiments where various issues related to democracies were included. And as far as I've seen, that was never one of the issues that people cared the most about. And so it may have been a little bit of an odd choice as the top thing for the Harris campaign. Of course, this is hard to separate from a broader point that they were trying to make about Donald Trump's character. We don't have any data around trans rights, which emerged as sort of like a late in the campaign issue. It fits in the mold of these identity-inflected issues. The Republican position is just slightly more on the side of public opinion than the Democratic position. And then beyond that, we get into issues where the line between what's a public policy issue and what is simply just the state of the world gets blurry. And in fact, this is true for immigration as well. The Trump campaign talks a lot about crime, and of course the economy is something that was much, much talked about. And so those are two areas that well could have been impactful in this election. There was a recent Washington Post piece just before the election that was trying to think about the two campaign platforms. And it took elements of the Harris platform and took elements of the Trump platform and put a whole lot of these on a survey and asked average Americans, which of these things do you support? Which of these things do you oppose? And the headline of that article was all about the idea that many, many more of the things that Harris supported in her platform were supported by a majority in these polls. And although there were plenty of popular Trump proposals, there were a lot more Trump proposals that were unpopular, right? Well, where I want to end with here is that we have to think about what elections are actually about, and particularly campaigns are all about trying to define what that election is going to be about. It's not about which campaign, which candidate in their long list of policy proposals that they support on their platform or on their website, which campaign wants to reduce restrictions on coal mining operations. Like that was not the central issue of the campaign, or reducing federal spending on foreign aid, or funding job training and addiction recovery services for the former prisoners, right? Those things just weren't things that were at the center of the campaign. So it's not enough for a candidate to have a whole lot of proposals that the electorate supports. It's really about what are the issues that define the campaigns. And that's what we have to think about when we're thinking about what role do issues play in elections like the election in 24.